Hi, and welcome to episode 29 of the DevelopSec podcast. I am your host, James Jardine, and today I want to talk a little bit about a new guide that was released by the Federal Trade Commission not too long ago, titled Start with Security, a Guide for Business. And basically it covers 10 practical lessons businesses can learn from the FTC's 50-plus data security settlements. At least that's what the headline says of the article that I'll link to in this posting. But what I like about this, so we often see where we'll get postings of, hey, here's things you can do. Here's the top 10 things you should be doing. You should be doing this. You should be doing that. And some are very highly technical. Some are not as technical. Really, you ask anybody in the business, you're going to get different things. Some people are going to be much more involved. They're going to be heavy around patching. Other people are heavy around segmentation. Other people are heavy around testing. But what I like about this is it's very practical. And what it does is it's actually providing you 10 items that you can do to help secure your business. And rather than being on the highly technical side, what they decided to do was come in on a, let's show from these settlements we've done where we've seen people do this wrong and be able to give you real world examples of what's going on so you can learn from that and understand. And it's not just me saying, hey, don't collect personal information if you don't need it, which is part of number one, which is start with security. We'll get into that a little bit. But instead of me just saying, hey, don't do that, now I've got a little bit of backup for this is why you shouldn't do this. And here's some example companies that we found that they were doing this incorrectly, and this is how it turned out to be a problem for them. Now we have an idea of, oh yeah, I see this company was listed. Oh, that makes a little bit more sense to me. So we're not diving real deep into technical. What we're doing is saying, hey, look, we're going to stay high level. We're going to list out 10 different things. These are probably all things that you've heard before, but we're going to take a different twist. We're going to take an angle where we point it out in a manner where we can relate it to cases that they've seen through the FTC. All right, and this is a concern. As we're going through security these days, we're seeing everybody get involved. The FTC is taking cases out, the SEC, you name it. If it's got three letters, they're probably involved somehow with some sort of cyber security incident. So we have to look at these events and study them and understand them. So hopefully what happened to somebody else will not happen to us. So again, I mentioned there's 10 things that they're covering in this document. And again, it's not highly technical, but it does pull together quite a few good kind of examples. They don't go real depth into the example, but they do give you a little bit of information about each one so you know what they're talking about. So here's the quick rundown of the top 10 items that they're covering. The number one, start with security. And really what that is, that's bringing you down and covering subtopics like, hey, don't collect personal information you don't need. All too often we overlook this and we just, hey, let's collect it all. Maybe down the line we'll need this information. But if there's really no need to collect it, you're better off not getting it, because then you don't have to worry about if that data gets breached or stolen and released somehow. Because if you didn't have it in the first place, you're pretty much covered. Also under that, hold on to information only as long as you have a legitimate business need. Again, we don't need to keep data around longer than we need to have it. Most companies have some sort of data retention policy, so you want to keep that in mind. But be aware of the data you have, and especially if it's sensitive data. You want to take that, you want to get rid of it when it's possible, right? You want to destroy it in a proper fashion. And then don't use personal information when it's not necessary. So those are kind of the high-level bullets of that start with security. Then we go on to, and I'll just run down the list real quick, and then we'll poke down through a couple of these as we go. Control access to data sensibly. Again, this is something we hear all the time, right? This is something we should be doing. Requiring secure passwords and authentication. Talk about this every day, talking about secure passwords. Authentication systems are critical, and making sure that we're following the best practices is important. So we'll touch on that a little bit. Store sensitive personal information securely and protect it during transmission. Again, we need to make sure that we are storing information properly, whether it's encrypted, if it's passwords, if they're hashed properly, if we're salting them, however we're doing it, making sure we're doing it according to industry best practices, and also protecting during transition, right? Using that HTTPS secure channel going back and forth. Segmenting your network and monitor who's trying to get in and getting out. Dave Kennedy just tweeted, I don't know, a week or two ago, something about one of the biggest things people could do is segment their networks. As a pen tester, we come in, we start testing a network, you get in a little administrative assistance box, and next thing you know, you have access to everything because there's very little network segmentation. And then even once we do get in, it's nothing to get back out, right? There's no egress filtering. There's nothing there that once I'm in, it's very simple to hop around. And being able to segment that network is critical. Another great example of the segmenting of the network is, I'm sure you're aware, you've seen the big news media hype about Charlie Miller and his partner working on hacking a Jeep going down the highway, blah, blah, blah. But really, I mean, one of the key situations there is it wouldn't have been as possible to do what they did, controlling the vehicle remotely, if there had been better segmentation amongst the systems within the vehicle. So segmentation can be important, and it's not just limited to a corporate network. Number 6, secure remote access to your network, right? Who has access in? We'll cover that a little bit more. 7, applying sound security practices when developing new products, which is something that I focus a lot on, and what DevelopSec is really based upon is the application development lifecycle and creating a secure SDLC and making sure that we're putting that focus there. 8, make sure your service providers implement reasonable security measures. How often are we seeing we're using outside parties to do a lot of stuff? We're using different service providers. We need to make sure that they're being held to a standard that we're being held to internally. 9, put procedures in place to keep your security current and address vulnerabilities that may arise. Right? Making sure that we have a way to handle this when this stuff comes up. And then finally, 10, actually kind of drops out of the cyber world a little bit and actually goes into the physical, where it's securing paper, physical media, and different devices. So I already talked a little bit about starting with security, right? What type of information are you collecting? How long are you holding on to it? Don't use it if you don't need it. We'll go back to number 2, controlling access to data sensibly, right? Restricting access to sensitive data. Not everybody needs access to every record in a database. Same goes with things like file shares, making sure that we're restricting access there, that if I can get on the network, I don't have immediate access to all your shares out there. Limiting your administrative access. This could be pretty critical, right? Not everybody needs to be an administrator on the network. Not everybody needs to have administrator access. Limit this down to those that need to have the access, and everybody else. And again, they do go into some different kind of interesting examples where they pull out some things. I'll give you a real quick example from the document here from limit administrative access, which basically they say it allows a user to make system-wide changes to your system and should be limited to employees tasked with that job. In the action against Twitter, for example, the FTC alleged that the company granted almost all of its employees administrative control over Twitter's systems, including the ability to reset user account passwords, view users' non-public tweets, and send tweets on users' behalf. Right? So, according to that, they're saying Twitter increased the risk that a compromise of any of its employees' credentials could result in a serious breach. So, I like how they come in here and they give an example of what the issue is, example of how it could be abused, right? That, man, we're really not thinking about it. Okay, I trust my employees, they have access to all this information, but we have to think about it from a path of what happens if an employee gets breached. Maybe they're not the ones that's malicious, but if their account gets breached, what are they going to have access to? And did they really need to have all that to do their job? So we have to think about that type of stuff. The next step, number 3, require secure passwords and authentication, right? Insisting on complex and unique passwords. Funny, we talk about this all the time. Passwords, authentication. People complain on Twitter all day long about these big banks that have bad password complexity requirements. Oh, they only allow me to have up to 10 characters. And we've said for a long time that really 15 is the minimum for a really good secure password. But that's where we are, right? In that situation where there's lots of companies that are not meeting what we would say is good complexity, right? Because we have this issue that passwords are difficult. So how do we keep track of them? And obviously doing things like password managers, which I'm actually going to talk about in another podcast coming up, is the use of password managers. There was actually an interesting article about a company that was blocking the use of password managers on their site. So I want to talk about that a little bit more in another episode. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So insisting on complex and unique passwords, storing passwords securely, making sure that you're not storing them in plain text. You're not storing them in a very simple hashing algorithm that's very easy to crack. That if your passwords get breached, we have some way to be able to kind of hope that they're not going to get reversed anytime soon. And that can be an issue. So again, they put a reference in here, and I'll just use Twitter because we used it in the last one. And Twitter too, the FTC said the company failed to establish policies that prohibited employees from storing administrative passwords in plain text in personal email accounts, which is something we don't always think about, is that when we're emailing these passwords or we're doing this other stuff with passwords, it's not always just the database. But again, good examples. They also have an example of Reed Elsevier, I'm not really sure how that's pronounced, and also guidance software, all for storing passwords securely. Guarding against brute force attacks, another key thing when we're talking about passwords and authentication. Obviously, we don't want people be able to easily brute force into our systems and gain access to these accounts. And then protecting against authentication bypass, right? Making sure that we are testing the web application for widely known security flaws, including, and in this example, it was lookout services for predictable resource location, where I could easily predict how the patterns of URLs looked, and I could make guesses at resources that were there. And if I were able to guess what those were, then I could actually gain access to the files without authenticating, in essence, bypassing the authentication, right? That's something that is part of OWASP Top 10, that we shouldn't be able to just go to a resource without being authenticated. A lot of times we look at that as a security by obscurity. I only show the menu for the people that should have access to those items, and I don't show it to anybody else. Not really the best way to go in those situations. We also have the next item, which is store sensitive personal information securely and protect it during transmission. Right, so making sure that if we are collecting sensitive information, we are keeping it secure throughout its life cycle, from when the user enters it in to send it up to our server, to all the way through to where it gets stored and then back down to the server again. Right, we want to make sure we keep that information secure the whole way, using industry tested and accepted methods, and then ensuring proper configuration. The next item, number 5, segment your network. We talked about this a little bit more, right? It's important that we segment our network. It goes beyond just segmenting IT from this, or right, making sure that only the people that need access to the administrative interfaces have access to administrative, and everybody else is segmented off, right? Take all that administrative stuff and put it in its own segment. Take point of sale systems and put it in its own segment on the network that is very locked down and very limited, so that way it's very difficult to get in and out of that network, so that way we can better protect that data. And as we're doing this, we need to make sure that we're monitoring the activity on our network so we can see when things are abnormal. And when you think about monitoring your activity, think about creating baselines, understanding what your normal traffic looks like so you can easily identify when that traffic changes, right? But you have to be monitoring that data. Number 6, secure remote access to your network, right? Making sure that you have endpoint security, protecting these systems that are coming in, making sure that you're not just letting anybody connect into your system or any other system connect in, that there are certain requirements that have to be met. Most times in your network, you're required to have antivirus and XYZ security controls on the network, well, make sure that your remote access has the same type of thing to ensure that the systems are less risky as they come in, right? Put other sensible access limits in place, right? Making sure that you're restricting third-party access to the segments that they need. Think about HVAC systems. Think about these other things where we have to get in to monitor and control certain items. Let's make sure we limit that back and deal with those, and don't let them have access to everything. Number 7, applying sound security practices when developing new products. Like I said, this is kind of the big one here. This is where the main focus is. And this is where we're saying, train your engineers in secure coding, right? Making sure that developers have that secure coding training. And more than just developers for me, right? It goes into QA, it goes into BA. It's everybody involved in the SDLC should have security training going on. Making sure that you're following platform guidelines for security, right? What system are you using? What framework are you using to develop with? How does that framework work with security? Make sure you're following those guidelines so that way you're able to use it to the best of its ability, but you also understand where are the downfalls, where are the negatives, and where are the gaps that framework offers, that you're ensuring that you're using what you need. Right? If you're on iOS and they recommend using the keychain for storing sensitive information, well, then use the keychain for storing, right? Use what's there and use what's been tested and tried and we know works really well versus trying to roll your own stuff. You want to verify that privacy and security features work. So if you're saying, hey, we keep this sort of information private and this is how we do it, that we're actually doing that stuff and not letting stuff stick around. And they give an example here. In Snapchat, the company advertised that messages would disappear forever, but the FTC says it failed to ensure the accuracy of that claim, right? That, hey, wait a minute, that's supposed to disappear, but we don't have any way to really actually make it disappear. So we're not keeping up to what we're saying we're doing. And we need to make sure we do that because privacy is critical. It's an important point, especially when we talk about security, of making sure that we're honoring people's privacy. And if we're going to say we're going to do something, we need to make sure we're testing that to make sure it is actually being done. And then, of course, testing for common vulnerabilities, dealing with OWASP, the Open Web Application Security Project, the top 10, looking for things like SQL injection, cross-site scripting, logic attacks, all these different things. You should definitely be testing for those things. And if you're not, then if in the event something happens, you could find yourself on the wrong end of the FTC coming in and investigating you to see whether you did the stuff you were supposed to be doing or you claim to be doing. Okay, on number 8, make sure your service providers implement reasonable security measures. All right, 1, just like anything in business, make sure you put it in writing that you're insisting that appropriate security standards are part of your contracts. You can't overlook this part, right? If you're dealing with third parties or other service providers, make sure the contracts have security verbiage in place to make sure you're covered in the event that something on their side happens. And also verify it, right? Verify their compliance to make sure they're doing what they say they're doing. Number 9, put procedures in place to keep your security current and address vulnerabilities and address vulnerabilities that may arise. Right, updating and patching third-party software. This is critical where we see update and patching, right? We say it all the time. We need to update. One of the most critical things you can do is update your systems, update your software, all that stuff, right? There's security fixes in there. And the same thing goes for all that third-party software that you may be using, keeping that up to date. It's not just your servers. It's not just your internal applications, but that third-party software is important as well. And then heed credible security warnings and move quickly to fix them. We are in the, realm of the researcher, if you will. So when you're seeing stuff being put out there, hey, there's security warnings about a project. Hey, Apache just had this security issue released. Maybe there's something in your stuff that's out there, right? If you're given security warnings, it's probably time you need to make sure you're updating that system, right? If there's something you can do make sure that you're updating properly so you can handle that. So you're not just ignoring it, right? Because if a warning comes out and says, hey, this is out there and this is really bad and you're affected by it, you're not doing your due diligence, making sure you have updated that or fixed the issue. Granted, it can be difficult at times to install certain patches. It may break something in your system, something you have to work out, and at the very least document the reasoning why it's taking longer than expected to get that stuff updated. But you want to have a process in place to receive security vulnerability reports, be able to fix this stuff, and work with this process to get everything handled. And then finally, number 10, the securing paper, physical media, and devices. Right? Again, securely store your sensitive files, make sure stuff's locked up, that not just anybody has access to everything. If there's sensitive information, you want to protect it. Protecting the devices that process personal information, having PIN data, stuff like that, making sure that those type of devices are protected from attack, even physical attack. Right? If I can actually go to it, I don't know if you've seen just recently, and I think Black Hat or DEF CON, they're doing a talk about hacking into one of these big super safes, and it's got a USB connection on it, and they're able to connect the USB to it, and it opens the door right up. Now that may be the simple version of it, but again, we can't forget the physical access to stuff. That when you have devices, you need to make sure they're protected, especially if you're dealing with things like money or processing personal information. That somebody can't come into your credit card reader and install malware on it, so that way it can start skimming credit cards and that type of stuff. Keep safety standards in place when data is en route. Again, we need to make sure that we're protecting data. It's not always about over the wire, right? Could be in the vehicle. We see all the time breaches where somebody left a laptop in the car, it was in the back seat, it was in the trunk, it was unencrypted during travel. All that stuff is stuff we need to think about as we're getting ready to deal with sensitive data. And then finally on this list is dispose of sensitive data securely. Right? And this is a good idea too, that, hey, look, if you got sensitive data, you don't want it to be the confetti that's raining down on New Year's in New York City. You don't want it to be the confetti at the parade after the Super Bowl. You want to make sure that it is being disposed of securely, that paper's being shredded and disposed of, that drives are being taken care of as they're supposed to be taken care of, so you're not risking that information getting out. So that kind of is a quick overview. I could probably actually do an individual podcast for every single one of these items to dig into it a little bit more. Maybe we'll dig into that as we go and break it down a little bit more. But that's kind of an overview of the Start With Security, a guide for business from the FTC. And again, I like the route they're going with this. I like the fact that they're pulling in real-world companies that have had issues where we can relate to this. It's not just, oh yeah, that's theoretical. It's, no, somebody actually had this issue. So please take a moment, look it over, read it over. It's not heavy reading. It's not long at all. And it's very high level, so it's not technical. You're not going to get lost in jargon. It's very easy to read for anybody, so you don't have to feel like you'll be overwhelmed going into it. So check it out. That's episode 29, and we will catch you next time.